Welcome to another After Effects quick tutorial. Today I'm going to show you two methods on how to create objects that looks 3D without using any 3D features. Well, just a disclaimer, this is by no means your typical 3D objects, but rather this is meant to trick your eyes into believing that these are actually 3D with an added sense of depth in the objects. Alright, with that out of the way, let's get started. For the first method, we're going to create a 3D looking object that looks somewhat like a photo frame with an added sense of depth. First thing first, we need to create a new shape layer. So let's name this as main border. We're going to create a border with a slightly brighter color. So go to stroke, select solid color, and we're going to disable the fill color for now. Give it a thickness of maybe 15 is good enough. Select the pen tool and draw a rough shape that looks somewhat like this. You can adjust all these settings accordingly. Maybe 15 is a bit too much. Let's reduce this to maybe 13. Now we got to duplicate this main border. So select the main border, go right up to edit and duplicate this. Now we got to rename this as main border shader. And we drag this to be right below the main border. Go right up to stroke, color, and select this as black. Just to make sure that we see the black color, let's toggle the transparency grid. And go to Effects and Preset and look for Blur. If you don't see Effects and Preset, you can go right up to Windows and select Effects and Preset from here. Now select Blur. We need a Gaussian blur. So drag Gaussian blur onto the main border shader. Ensure that the blur dimension is set to horizontal and vertical. And increase the blurriness to a suitable figure that looks like that. And let's increase the stroke a little bit. Let's increase the blurriness slightly, because we don't want a shader that has too much of a solid color overflowing it. Something that looks like that is good enough. Now we see the outer edge of the boundary flowing from underneath the main border itself. So how do we get rid of this? Select main border shader. Now right click and pre-comp. Ensure that move all attribute into the new composition is selected. Go back to pen tool. Now we're going to create a mask around the main border. Something that looks like that. Let's toggle the transparency layer again so that it looks. Alright, so select the main border. We're going to create a main background. We're going to duplicate this. Let's rename this as main background. Drag this right to the bottom of everything. And disable the stroke. Enable the solid color for the fill option. Let's give it a color that looks somewhat brighter. Something like that should be good enough. So right now we can basically stop and we can say, okay, this is a photo frame with an added sense of depth. But let's make this look slightly better, shall we? So under preset, effects and preset, look for beaver alpha. So select this and drag this onto the main border. So give this a suitable, let's disable the guide so that we see this better. So give this a suitable figure, something like that, that doesn't look too overwhelming. Okay, so next we're going to improve the background. Select the main background. We're going to duplicate this. Let's call this main background effects. Go to effects and preset, look for noise. We're going to select the noise HLS and drag this onto the effect layer. So under lightness, increase this to a suitable number that looks like that. Now go back to effect and preset. Under blur, search for blur, we need the directional blur. Now drag the directional blur to right below the noise HLS. Under direction, let's give it a 45%. And we drag the blur length to a good figure that makes the background looks like that. Maybe a tiny bit more. Yep, something like that. So if I toggle the transparency grid, you may or may not see the overflowing main background effect from underneath the boundary. So you may or may not get it. But just to play safe, let's create a mask around that. It is basically the same thing. Right click on main BG effect and let's create a precomp. Move all attribute into the new composition and use a pen tool to create a mask around the main boundary. So that way we ensure that nothing is actually overflowing out of the intended boundary. So there you have it. This is a very basic rundown on how to create a 3D object without using any 3D feature that looks something like that. So this is, let's call it the photo frame method. So this is method 1. Now for method 2. Let's call this the cylinder method. First thing first, create a new shape layer. We're going to call this the main background. And disable stroke. Select fill option and let's select a solid color for this. Let's give it a slightly darker color. Something that looks like that. So copy the hex code because you will need it later. Okay. And we're going to draw a rectangular shape that looks like that. It can be any shape that you want it to be. It is basically the same strategy. You can use it across a lot of shapes. So I'm just doing it simple to illustrate the steps. Now we need to duplicate this main background. Let's call this the main background effects. For this, we need to change this to a linear gradient. So select that. Before you make changes to that, right click on the main background effect, go to transform and select center anchor point in layer content. So the idea behind this is to center the anchor point right smack in the middle of this object, because we will need to shrink this down just a tiny bit. So go right to scale, uncheck constraint proportion and reduce the second figure to something that looks like that. So you want to see a bit of the main background from on top of the effect layers, something like that. You can adjust this as we go along. Now with the main background effect selected, we need to trigger the indicator. So drag one end of the indicator to the topmost boundary of the effect layer. Ensure that that is the effect layer that you're matching it. And drag the other point to the bottommost. So high chance you will have a gradient that may look something like that. So what you need to do is you need to add 2 points and paste the color that we use for the solid background onto this 2 medium point. So you want it to look something like that. For the 0 and 100%, you want a slightly brighter gray color. So it can be gray color or it can be any color that you choose. But the idea behind this is you need a slightly brighter tone of the color that you selected. So in this case, it is a brighter gray color. So something that looks like that. And we're going to adjust this 2 point in such a way that the aspect ratio between this is somewhat like a 30% or 30% for maybe not 30%, like 10%, 60%, and 20%. So we want the darker border to have about 60% of the whole region. So something like that. So you're going to play by the eye. There isn't a exact figure that that you may need to follow. Somewhat like that. Okay, click OK. Now we're going to go to blur and look for directional blur and drag this onto the main BG effect. Sorry, not the directional blur, the Gaussian blur. Under the blur dimension, select vertical. We just want to blur this along the vertical axis. Let me disable the guide so that we see this in a better way. Now we're going to increase the blurriness to a good figure that the edges is blurred out and it looks like it is blended onto the main border, something like that. Yep, that is it for the cylinder method. So with this method itself, you can venture out and go complex. You can play around with other shapes. But the idea behind this is to use the gradient to trick the eye into thinking that there is a depth to the object that you're adding the gradient to. So this makes this look slightly 3D. So once again, these are not your typical 3D object conversion. Notice that I did not use any 3D objects feature. I did not convert this to 3D object. So if you are not looking at converting any objects into total 3D, you don't need to do that. You just need to give it a sense of depth. These two are the best method to use to turn an object into 3D looking like, basically once again to trick the eye into thinking that this is 3D. Okay, that is going to be it for today's quick tutorial. If you guys got any question to ask, put it in the comment section right below. And if there are any effects, anything that you guys want to see me do, put it right there. I will try my best to see if I can fulfill them. Alright, until the next time, I will catch you guys again.